How does someone who once looked at you with love become someone who can't even look you in the eyes? How does a person who promised to stay forever suddenly disappear, or worse, become cold, distant, even cruel? For many people, this is the most painful part of a breakup. Not that the relationship ended, but that the person they loved seems to have transformed into someone they no longer recognize. One day, you're sharing your dreams together. The next, every conversation feels like a battle. Every message sounds cold. Every word feels calculated. And eventually, you begin asking yourself a question that millions of people have asked before. Was any of it real? It's a natural question, but psychology suggests something surprising. Most of the time, the love was real. The problem isn't that people suddenly stop feeling. The problem is that heartbreak changes the way people protect themselves. To understand why, we first need to understand something about the human brain. When we fall in love, our brains don't simply experience emotion, they build attachment. During a healthy relationship, chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin reinforce closeness. Your partner becomes associated with comfort, safety, reward. Their voice can calm your nervous system. Their presence becomes familiar. Over time, your brain begins treating that person as part of your emotional stability. That's why losing a relationship doesn't feel like losing an object. It feels like losing a part of your daily life, a part of your future, even a part of your identity. Researchers using brain imaging have found that romantic rejection activates some of the same brain regions involved in physical pain. In other words, when people say, "My heart hurts," their brain is experiencing something much closer to real pain than most people realize. That's why heartbreak can affect sleep, appetite, concentration, memory, motivation, even the immune system. Your brain isn't simply processing sadness, it's responding to loss. But here's where things become complicated. Not everyone responds to emotional pain in the same way. Some people cry, some withdraw, some become anxious, others become angry, very angry. Why? Because anger is often easier to tolerate than grief. Think about it. Sadness makes us feel vulnerable. It forces us to admit that someone mattered, that we've lost something valuable. Anger does the opposite. Anger creates distance. It gives us energy. It makes us feel powerful when we actually feel powerless. Psychologists have long described anger as a secondary emotion. In many situations, anger isn't the first feeling. It's the shield protecting the first feeling. Beneath anger, there is often disappointment, fear, rejection, shame, or heartbreak. Imagine someone who has just been left by the person they believed they would spend the rest of their life with. Admitting, "I'm devastated," requires enormous vulnerability. Saying, "I never cared anyway," is emotionally much easier. So the mind begins protecting itself. Sometimes that protection looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like indifference. Sometimes it looks like cruelty. This is why people often say things during breakups that don't reflect how they truly felt. Not because they're always lying, but because emotional pain changes the way people communicate. When emotions become overwhelming, many people stop trying to be understood. They start trying to survive, and survival rarely brings out the best in us. There's another reason breakups become so emotionally explosive. Relationships don't only create love, they also create expectations, plans, shared routines, inside jokes, future vacations, dreams about growing old together. When a relationship ends, you don't only lose a partner, you lose the future your mind had already started building. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the loss of the imagined future. The grief isn't only about what happened, it's also about everything that will never happen. The holidays you imagined, the home you wanted to buy, the family you pictured, the life you quietly assumed would exist. That's why people often say, "I don't even know who I am anymore," because for months or years, their identity included another person. And when that person leaves, the mind has to rebuild the story of who they are. This process is rarely calm. It often feels chaotic, confusing, even frightening. And during that confusion, people don't always behave like the version of themselves you once knew. But heartbreak alone still doesn't explain why some breakups become battles, why people suddenly become cold. why they ignore messages, why they say things designed to hurt, or why someone who once loved you begins acting like you're the enemy. Because after heartbreak, another powerful force quietly steps in. Not love, not grief, but the human ego. If heartbreak explains the pain, the ego often explains the war. One of the biggest misconceptions about breakups is the belief that people become cruel because they stopped loving someone. Sometimes that's true, but often their behavior has much less to do with love and much more to do with what the breakup means to their identity. A relationship is more than two people spending time together. It becomes part of how we see ourselves. I'm someone's partner. I'm loved. I'm chosen. I'm important to someone. When that relationship ends, those beliefs are suddenly challenged. And for many people, that feels like more than rejection. It feels like humiliation, especially if they didn't choose the breakup or if they believed the relationship would last forever. This is where the ego enters the picture. The ego isn't simply arrogance. In psychology, it's the part of us that protects our sense of self. When that sense of self is threatened, the mind immediately searches for ways to reduce the emotional pain. Unfortunately, those strategies aren't always healthy. One of the most common defense mechanisms is devaluation. The person who once seemed perfect suddenly becomes toxic, immature, selfish, the worst thing that ever happened to me. This doesn't necessarily mean those descriptions are accurate. It means the mind is trying to make separation easier. If your brain convinces you the other person wasn't worth loving, losing them becomes less painful. It's a psychological shortcut. Another common defense mechanism is projection. Instead of facing uncomfortable emotions inside ourselves, we place them onto someone else. A person who feels rejected may accuse their ex of being cold. Someone overwhelmed by guilt may insist the breakup was entirely the other person's fault. It's easier to attack someone else than to sit with painful emotions we don't fully understand. Then there's silence. For many people, being ignored hurts more than being argued with. After all, an argument at least proves the other person still cares enough to respond. Silence feels different. Silence feels like you've become invisible. This is why being left on read or receiving no response at all can feel so emotionally overwhelming. But silence isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's protection. People cut off communication for different reasons. Some do it to create emotional distance. Some fear that one conversation will reopen old wounds. Some know that if they keep talking, they'll never move on. Others use silence as a form of control, and that's where things become unhealthy. When silence is used to create anxiety, to provoke guilt, or to make someone beg for attention, it stops being a boundary. It becomes manipulation. Another behavior that confuses people is unnecessary cruelty. You've probably heard stories like these. Someone ends a relationship and within days begins posting photos with someone new. Someone returns their partner's belongings in the coldest way possible. Someone makes hurtful comments that seem completely out of character. Why? Because emotional pain often creates a desperate need to regain control. Imagine standing in a room where everything familiar suddenly disappears. That's what a breakup can feel like emotionally. Control becomes one of the few things people believe they still have, so they try to control the narrative. They want to decide who was right, who was wrong, who moved on first, who suffered less, who won the breakup. But relationships aren't competitions. There are no winners. Only people carrying pain in different ways. Some carry it openly, others hide it behind anger, others bury themselves in work, some rush into another relationship, not because they're completely over their ex, but because being alone forces them to face emotions they've spent years avoiding. Psychologists sometimes call this a rebound relationship. Contrary to popular belief, not every rebound begins with bad intentions. Many people genuinely believe they're ready to move on, but sometimes they're simply trying to replace emotional stability before they've rebuilt it within themselves. That's why rebounds can feel incredibly intense at first. The excitement temporarily distracts from grief. The attention feels validating. The loneliness becomes quieter. But distraction is not the same as healing. Eventually, the emotions that were postponed often return, sometimes months later, sometimes years later. Perhaps the hardest truth about breakups is this: the person hurting you may also be hurting. Not always, but more often than we realize. Pain doesn't automatically make people kinder. Sometimes it makes them defensive, sometimes impatient, sometimes emotionally unavailable, sometimes cruel. Understanding that doesn't excuse harmful behavior. Cruelty is still cruelty. Manipulation is still manipulation. Abuse is never justified. But understanding why people behave the way they do can free you from one exhausting question: why would someone who loved me treat me like this? Because love and emotional maturity are not the same thing. A person can genuinely love you and still lack the emotional skills to handle loss in a healthy way. They can care deeply and still respond with anger instead of honesty, with avoidance instead of communication, with pride instead of vulnerability. And that leads to one of the strangest parts of modern breakups. Even after the relationship is over, many people don't actually let go. They keep watching, checking, comparing, wondering, not through conversations, but through a screen. Years ago, when a relationship ended, people disappeared from each other's lives. You packed away the photographs. You stopped calling. Eventually, life moved on. Today, breakups rarely end that cleanly. Instead, they continue through a screen. You stop talking, but you keep watching. A new photo, a new follower, a new vacation, a new relationship. Without realizing it, many people stay emotionally connected long after the relationship is over. Not because they're still in love, but because their brain is still searching for answers. One of the strongest psychological forces after a breakup is uncertainty. The human brain dislikes unfinished stories. Researchers call this the Zeigarnik effect, our tendency to remember incomplete experiences more vividly than completed ones. That's why unanswered questions stay in your mind. Did they ever really love me? Are they happier now? Do they miss me? Was I the problem? Every time you open their profile, your brain believes it might finally find the answer, but it almost never does. Instead, it finds something else, a carefully edited version of reality. Social media isn't real life, it's a highlight reel. People rarely post their anxiety, their loneliness, their regrets. They post celebrations, smiles, vacations, new relationships, achievements. And after a breakup, those images become incredibly easy to misinterpret. Your ex uploads one smiling photo, and your brain concludes, they've completely forgotten me. But a photograph can't tell you what happened before it was taken, or after. It can't tell you whether someone cried the night before, whether they're trying to convince themselves they're okay, or whether they're simply trying to keep living. This is why social media becomes such a dangerous source of emotional information. We mistake appearances for truth. Then there's another psychological trap: intermittent reinforcement. It's one of the most powerful learning mechanisms ever discovered. Imagine a slot machine. If it paid out every time, people would quickly lose interest. If it never paid out, they would stop playing. But unpredictable rewards keep people addicted. Relationships sometimes work the same way, especially unhealthy ones. Maybe your ex ignores you for weeks, then suddenly likes one of your photos. Maybe they block you, then unblock you. Maybe they send a message, then disappear again. Every small interaction creates hope. Your brain starts expecting another reward. Not because it's rational, but because uncertainty keeps the emotional bond alive. That's why many people spend months checking their phones. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because their brain has learned to expect unpredictable emotional rewards. Another common behavior after a breakup is trying to prove you've moved on. Posting happier photos, working out obsessively, buying expensive things, showing a new relationship as quickly as possible. Sometimes those changes are genuine, but sometimes they're performances, not for the world. For one person, the ex, it's called impression management. Instead of healing internally, people try to control how they're perceived externally. They want their former partner to think, look how amazing I'm doing, look what you lost, you'll regret leaving me. But here's the irony: the more someone needs to prove they've moved on, the less likely it is that they actually have. People who have truly healed usually stop performing because they no longer need validation from the person they left behind. Healing is quiet, performance is loud. There's another mistake almost everyone makes after a breakup. They replay the relationship like a movie, but they only replay the best scenes. the late night conversations, the vacations, the laughter, the first kiss, the small moments that made everything feel possible. What disappears are the arguments, the disappointments, the loneliness, the unmet needs, the reasons the relationship ended in the first place. Psychologists call this rosy retrospection. Our minds often remember the past more positively than it actually was, not because we're lying to ourselves, but because memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time we remember something, our brain rebuilds it, and emotions influence what gets included. That's why people often miss relationships that were making them deeply unhappy. They're not necessarily missing reality. They're missing the version of reality their brain has edited. Perhaps the hardest truth is this: closure rarely arrives in the form we expect. Many people believe they need one final conversation, one perfect explanation, one apology, one confession, one answer that suddenly makes everything make sense. But life rarely works that way. Some people leave without explaining. Some never apologize. Some don't fully understand their own reasons. And even when explanations are given, they often don't satisfy us, because we're searching for certainty. Not information. The uncomfortable reality is that healing doesn't begin when someone finally gives you answers. It begins when you stop expecting them to. The moment you stop asking another person to explain your worth, you take back something far more valuable than the relationship. You take back your peace, and that's where the real process of moving on finally begins. If you've ever been through a painful breakup, you've probably asked yourself one question more than any other: when will this stop hurting? Most people assume healing is simply a matter of time. Time helps, but time alone doesn't heal. If it did, no one would still be thinking about a relationship that ended 5 years ago. Healing happens when the brain finally accepts that the story is over, and that acceptance is much harder than most people realize, because after a breakup, we're not only grieving another person, we're grieving the version of ourselves that existed with them, the routines, the future we imagined, the identity we built around the relationship. Letting go isn't forgetting someone, it's learning to live without needing them to complete your story. This is why so many people stay emotionally trapped. They believe moving on means no longer thinking about their ex. That's impossible. The brain doesn't erase meaningful memories, it stores them. What changes is the emotional charge attached to those memories. One day, you'll remember them. But your heart won't race, your stomach won't sink, you won't feel the urge to check their profile. You'll simply remember, like remembering an old city you once visited. Important, but no longer home. One of the biggest obstacles to healing is believing that your ex owes you something: an apology, an explanation, a conversation, justice. Many people postpone their own recovery while waiting for words that may never come. But here's something difficult to accept. Even if your ex apologized tomorrow, it might not change how you feel, because pain doesn't disappear the moment someone says, "I'm sorry." Sometimes the apology arrives too late. Sometimes it isn't sincere. And sometimes the wound was never really about the breakup. It was about what the breakup made you believe about yourself. I wasn't enough. I wasn't worth fighting for. I'll never be loved again. Those are the beliefs that need healing, not the relationship itself. Another mistake people make is trying to erase the past. They throw away every photo, delete every message, pretend the relationship never happened. Sometimes that's necessary, especially after abusive relationships. But in many cases, healing doesn't come from pretending something never existed. It comes from accepting that it existed and that it ended. Every relationship teaches something. Sometimes it teaches us how we want to be loved. Sometimes it teaches us what boundaries we ignored. Sometimes it reveals patterns we've been repeating for years. If you only ask, "Why did they do this to me?" you'll stay focused on the other person. A more powerful question is, "What is this experience trying to teach me about myself?" That question changes everything, because now your attention returns to the one person you can actually change: you. Eventually, there comes a moment that surprises almost everyone. You wake up one morning and realize they weren't the first thing you thought about. You hear their name, and it doesn't ruin your day. You see an old photograph, and instead of pain, you feel gratitude. Not because everything was perfect, but because you survived something you once believed would break you forever. That is what moving on actually looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending, not hating. simply reaching the point where your peace no longer depends on another person's choices. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson every breakup has to offer. Love is never guaranteed. People change. Relationships end. Promises are sometimes broken. None of us can control that. But we can choose what happens next. We can spend years trying to understand someone who has already left, or we can begin understanding ourselves, because the end of one relationship is not the end of your ability to love. It is not proof that you are unworthy. It is not evidence that you'll always be alone. It's simply the end of one chapter. And chapters are not the whole story. One day, someone new may walk into your life, or perhaps they won't for a while. Either way, your happiness cannot depend on whether another person stays. Real emotional freedom begins the moment your self-worth is no longer tied to someone else's decision to love you. That's when you stop chasing closure. You stop replaying old conversations. You stop wondering what could have been, and you finally make room for what still can be. Because the healthiest relationships are not built by people who were never hurt. They're built by people who learned that losing someone doesn't mean losing themselves. And maybe that's the most important truth of all. Sometimes the relationship that changes your life the most isn't the one that lasts forever. It's the one that teaches you that your value was never determined by the person who chose to leave.